the way in which this war shapes a new stage in historical development of the region and I would say of the world as a whole, because we are a very different place today than we were after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Democracy has been in trouble. How many people were out there prepared to fight for it, to put their lives in risk, put their lives on line? That's what Ukrainians are doing. They're saying that they're fighting for freedom and democracy, and they mean it. They're not doing that to please the West. One very important stage in the global development really came to an end with this war, and the new is just being formed. We don't know what it will be yet.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name's Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. Today is one of my most important conversations as I chat with Serhii Plokhy about the Ukrainian people's struggle against the Russian invasion. Serhii is a historian of Ukraine and is professor of history at Harvard University. He's had family members and friends killed during the fighting, so as well as his interest in his homeland's plight, it's personal for him too. Serhii has written a book on that invasion, as well as Ukraine's independence and relationship with Russia. It's called the Russo-Ukrainian War. Coming up on the podcast, I've got Charles Spencer on Charles II, the greatest British commander of all time. That's not Charles II, by the way. As well as a chat on the Parthenon marble. So please do subscribe, rate and review. I'd be hugely grateful. In the meantime, I'm going to hand you over to me talking with Serhii Plokhy on the war in Ukraine. Serhii Plokhy, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, I was just saying before we started recording how I've literally just finished the book this morning, and it, particularly reading the afterword, is very moving because you've got family members and friends, of course, who are fighting and have lost their lives as well. So this book, it was obviously very important as to why you wanted to write it just after the invasion happened back in February 22, is that right?
Yes, that's where I, after some hesitation, decided that I had to write that book. And that was February, early April, when I started working on it, not knowing, of course, what the ultimate result would be. We still are in the middle of the war. It's probably is far from over. But what I tried to do in that book is try to figure out for myself and then explain to others, explain to the readers how we got into that war, what the war demonstrated already during the first months and then during the first year of the hostilities. And I think that despite the fact that the war is far from over, we see already a number of trends emerging in terms of and can understand the way in which it changed not just Ukraine and Russia, but it changed the world. One of the first outcomes of the war is already also clear, that Ukraine survived and will survive as an independent state. And that gave me some confidence in not just going on with the manuscript, but also finishing it. And I think that what the book has to offer is much more than just discussion, the way how Russia, Ukraine, the world got into that war, but also can provide some answers about the future.
Well, yes, I mean, it's laid out very clearly from, I mean, I guess technically it's a book of history, but as you say, you know, things are ongoing. So I guess it's a bit of both current affairs and history. I mean, the first chapters deal with, well, I wanted to start there really, is a lot of listeners may know that Russia has always had sort of territorial intent when it comes to Ukraine, but why that is probably less clear. I know, and this goes back many hundreds of years as well, but it's a deep-seated, well, certainly with Putin and presumably with many people in Russia, but there's a deep-seated assumption, isn't there, that Russia should own Ukraine, as it were?
Yes, absolutely. What we see here, on the one hand, is a classic war of the disintegration of the empire. The disintegration of the Russian Empire started during World War One. Then the Bolsheviks stitched it together with a new type of ideology, new level of brutality. It lasted until the end of the Soviet Union in 91, and then a new stage of the disintegration of the empire was opened. And this war is the war that many observers expected to a degree at the end of the Soviet Union. It didn't happen, and it is happening now. So this is one level, the classic empire versus colony versus periphery versus the country that tries to break out from the imperial embrace.
Just whilst you mention that, Serhii, sorry to interrupt you, but I was going to ask this, but since you've mentioned it, is this sort of the last kick of a dying empire?
Well, I want it to be the last kick, but I can't. That's one of the questions that I maybe pose, but I can't provide answer to that. And the reason for that is that the stories of the disintegration of the empire is not one act play. It's not an event. It is a process. And that process can take not just decades, sometimes it can take centuries. I already talked about the disintegration of the Russian Empire and gave 1914 as the starting point. You can also think about the Ottomans. Their decline started in the 17th century, and the Balkan Wars of the 1990s is still the wars over reformatting of the place that was left by the Ottoman Empire on the one hand, Habsburgs on the other. So I really wanted to be the last kick. I really wanted to be the last act in that drama of the disintegration of the Russian Empire. I am not sure whether it would be, but I have no doubt that this is a major event in that story. It's a major event in the process of the reimagining, not just of Ukraine, but also of Russia as a post-imperial state.
Right. And so going back to my earlier question around the sort of historical reasons as to why the Russians have gone in.
That is a story that is imperial, but also a little bit different from other empires. Britain, of course, had enormous empire, but no one in London imagined that the origins of England or Britain were really somewhere in Delhi or in India. But this is the case with the Russian Empire. Till today, the majority probably of Russians believe that the origins of Russia, not as an empire but as a nation, are in Kiev. That's a very prominent, very powerful historical myth in Russia about their origins from Kiev, from the medieval state called Kievan Rus, and that's also partially a foundation for Putin's claims that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people. That's how you claim Kiev, and that's how you claim Kievan legacy. After the annexation of Crimea, they built a huge statue to Prince Volodymyr, who is a namesake of Vladimir Putin. And of course, Prince Volodymyr was prince in Kiev, not in Moscow, but his largest statue is today in Moscow. So there is imperial part of the story, and then there is ethno-national Russian identity that is closely connected and linked to a different country, which makes things more complicated and bizarre at the same time. So one of the reasons why the Russian war went so wrong was that completely misreading of history, misunderstanding of today's Ukraine, expectation that the Ukrainians who allegedly were really Russians would welcome Russian troops with flowers, and they welcomed them with stingers and other weapons. So history is written all over this war, from the way how Putin imagined or reimagined Russian imperial history, to the way in which this war shapes a new stage in historical development of the region, and I would say of the world as a whole, because we are in a very different place today than we were after the fall of the Berlin Wall. One very important stage in the global development really came to an end with this war, and the new is just being formed. We don't know what it will be yet.
Well, there's a view by some, and I don't share this, but there are some who feel that the reason for the invasion is NATO expansion, and that's the reason for the Russian invasion. That's not the case. You don't agree with that either?
I don't agree with that, and I provide a number of explanations in the book why I don't think that was the case. But here I just mention one, and the war produced results that, of course, Russia didn't expect. One of them was Finland joining NATO and Sweden breaking with more than 200 years of neutrality, and is about to join NATO. And this is also new development in comparison to the Cold War history. So if NATO would be a real threat, and if NATO would be of real concern for Russia, what you would see today is every single Russian soldier living in Ukraine and being moved to the border with Finland, because by Finland joining NATO, the Russian border with NATO was doubled. But I'm still waiting for evidence of at least one soldier or one officer being withdrawn from Ukraine and moved to the border with Finland. And what that suggests to me that NATO was a pretext. The real reason for the war is really deeply rooted into history, imperial history of Russia, and also of this confusion about Russian identity, really dedication to historical mythology about the origins of Russia and Russia coming from Kiev. So I put much more emphasis on this bad history than on concern about NATO. I'm not trying to say that Putin was particularly happy about expansion of NATO, but I don't see, I can't really make a credible argument that was a decisive factor. And what happened after the start of the war just confirms it.
Well, one event that happened a few months before the start of the war was the American withdrawal in Afghanistan. Do you think that encouraged Putin? I mean, he was always presumably intent on continuing his war in Ukraine, because, of course, as we know, it started 2014, really. But do you think the withdrawal meant that was a sort of almost a green light for Putin?
Well, that's certainly, I would say, an encouraging factor, because US really, in his mind, demonstrated absolute incompetence in dealing with the international issues and matters. Things don't go right, they withdraw. And he certainly expected the same sort of a behavior this time around. Not just from the United States, but from the Western community as a whole. And withdrawal from Afghanistan and the way how the Afghan army that was trained by the United States and allies, supplied and resupplied again and again, how it disappeared overnight, that certainly didn't add confidence to the American and Western intelligence services and politicians with regard to the ability of Ukrainian army to fight back. Everyone was concerned about Russian army. Everyone was afraid of Russia. So to imagine that Ukraine would fight back, and would fight back not just as small partisan groups here and there, but that the armed forces would be able to withstand the attack and then go on the counteroffensive, that was difficult to imagine, and partially also because of the experience of Afghanistan.
And I mean, this comes across in the book, but I wondered if you could just speak a bit about it, because here in the West, we see a lot of Zelensky, and he's, a huge hero now. which might give rise to the idea that he's a major factor as to why Ukraine fought back. But really, it's the Ukrainian people and that sense of identity that is the real reason. And I don't want to downplay Zelensky's role either.
Yeah, I exactly agree with that nuanced analysis of yours. Zelensky is an important figure, and the way how he handled himself and situation is very important. Again, speaking about the Afghanistan, the president there fled. That's again something that everyone expected. Zelensky, as we know, was offered to set up a government in exile, either in Warsaw or in London, and he refused to do that. So we can't downplay Zelensky, but Zelensky, in my reading, is really an amplifier. So his talent as a politician comes from his experience as an actor. He can read the audience, he understands the audience, and or public or his country. And the decision to fight and the spirit really comes from the Ukrainian people. Comes in that context, quote unquote, from the audience, that he is on the stage. He is reacting to what is happening in the room. At no point Ukraine the polling showed that the number of Ukrainians who believed in victory fell below 75%. I would give Zelensky and his leadership anywhere between 15 and 20% in that 75 to 80%, but the rest 60 or 55, the controlling package really belongs to the Ukrainian people.
It's extraordinary. And the Donbass and Crimea, which fell in 2014, it was so interesting reading the book, which I hadn't realized back in the early 90s. Is it 91, I think, when the referendum for independence for Ukraine, in those two regions, we're led to believe that there's a strong Russian identity, but the percentage, I think Crimea was 54% in favor of independence, and the Donbass much higher, over 80%.
Over 80%, yes.
And that's not really mentioned because we assume that the Donbass and Crimea are quote unquote Russian. I mean, that's clearly not the case, is it?
Yes, if that would be the case, we would have a so-called referendum in the Crimea in 2014 being opened to international observers and independent observers. We would also have a referendum that was not taking place under the military control, under the conditions of the military takeover. So while not saying that there were no percentage of the population in the Crimea that probably welcomed the Russian takeover of the peninsula, nothing that we have suggests that there was basically over 50%. Otherwise, we would see a very different referendum. And when it comes to Donbass, where the vote for independence was over 80%, there was a military takeover and hybrid warfare. The leaders of the puppet states that were created by Moscow were parachuted from Moscow as well. I discussed that. The so-called Minister of Defense of the Donetsk Republic was a former FSB officer, Mr. Strelkov, Gerkin, his real name, and the prime minister was Mr. Borodai, a political sort of spin doctor and political consultant, also coming from Moscow. That's an indication that, or one more indication that what happened in Donbass was also part of the military takeover by Russia, by Russian Federation. Ukraine turned out to be completely unprepared for that sort of scenario back in 2014. There was a change of the government as the result of the Revolution of Dignity of 2014. And I want to say that Ukrainian society, Ukrainian government certainly draw lessons from 2014. So when Putin came back, there was no any more illusions on what that meant. There were people with Ukrainian flags marching against the Russian tanks. We saw that on TV. We have a clear evidence of that. So the war that started in 2014 really transformed Ukraine. And one of Putin's big mistakes was that invading Ukraine in 2022, he believed that it was still largely Ukraine of 2014, and it wasn't.
I remember reading a report that I think I read it at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. There was a poll that the KGB, I think, had commissioned. I may have got this wrong, but it seemed to suggest, if you'd read the sort of summary report, it claimed there is a strong kinship between the Ukraine and Russia, which I guess no one would really deny prior to the invasion. But if you delved into sort of beyond the summary, it showed a really powerful Ukrainian identity. And it seems extraordinary to me that a Russia, the KG or the FSB, I should call it, the FSB would not read their own report.
I'm at the same time surprised and not surprised. I'm surprised because the leader of Russia is coming from that world, from FSB world, and is supposed to know better. But I'm not surprised, given that really Russia today is authoritarian regime. And even in democratic regimes, the intelligence services, maybe not always, but at least occasionally, bring to the boss only the news that boss wants to get and to hear. And that certainly happened. That certainly happened in Russia. I have no doubt in that regard. And Putin's thinking was really much influenced by his thinking about his legacy, which he understood in very imperial terms, Russian imperial terms, of gathering or regathering the lands of the former Russian Empire in one form or another, not exactly in the form of the Soviet Union, not exactly in the form of the Russian Empire, but certainly extending the Russian sphere of influence to the former imperial space. And then everything else was there to just to please the leader. We saw the televised meeting of the Russian Security Council where the decision go to war was made, and the body language, what was presided in there, made very clear it was basically a court of the Tsar, with really the rest of them trying to guess what he wanted, what his thoughts were, and then try to play accordingly.
So if we look at the rise then of Putin, who, as you say, I guess he's effectively the Tsar today. In the 90s, Boris Yeltsin, reading the book, Yeltsin is very much seen, I would say, by many here in the West as being responsible for Putin. And so Yeltsin's leadership of the Russian Federation in that period was therefore a complete disaster. But we should be thankful to Yeltsin in some ways. He used authoritarian methods to bring about democracy, or a form of democracy.
Yes, certainly he tried to do that, and he failed. Because once you create an authoritarian state with the goal of bringing democracy, the authoritarian state really crushes that democracy. So you can't get to democracy through authoritarianism. You can get to the market economy through authoritarianism. We now know that. We look at China. We look at in other places. But one thing where autocracy doesn't bring you to democracy. And everyone applauded Yeltsin back in the 1970s when he ordered his tanks to fire at the Russian parliament, and then rewrote constitution, because of course the people who rebelled against him were former communists and nationalists, and he was a democratically elected leader. But he created a constitution that then provided all the instruments necessary for the creation of a really authoritarian regime by his successor, who was Vladimir Putin. So it's not just the matter of getting it wrong and selecting the wrong person for the position and then manipulating the system of the democratic elections, which were not democratic. But the big issue is the creation, really, foundations for Russian authoritarianism by the most democratic of the Russian leaders of the 20th century.
Putin himself, we've seen with the last year's invasion, and then 2014, of course, the first invasion, and then we have Georgia in 2008. Had Ukraine fallen, I mean, it's a bit of a what if, I know, but if Ukraine had fallen, I was speaking to a Polish historian who is convinced that the Russians view Poland as similar, in a similar way to maybe, I don't know, the Baltics, that they should belong to the wider sort of Russian empire. Do you think it would have been a domino effect and Putin would have waited a little bit longer and then maybe looked at the Baltics and Poland?
I have no doubt that Baltics could very well be his next target. Certainly Moldova, there is no question about that, but Baltics as well. Because despite Baltics being in the European Union and being part of NATO, the thinking is still very much imperial and Soviet or post-Soviet. In Moscow, Baltics are still viewed as part of the Moscow sphere of influence. At least they should be brought back under the influence of Moscow. I think that if Baltics would follow, then there would be more encouragement, of course, to think about Poland as well. So I don't think that would be happening around the same time. But the importance of Ukraine is in the fact that it's not only about Ukraine. It is about the post-Soviet space in general. The Soviet Union fell apart in 1991 on the issue of Ukraine, on the issue of Ukrainian referendum. No one in Russia believed that it made sense to continue with the Soviet experiment without the second largest post-Soviet republic. And any Russian plans on reintegration of the post-Soviet space and post-imperial space also turned out to be dependent on Ukraine. That's why we have the war that we have today, partially because it's not just about Ukraine, it's about the Russian post-Soviet role in the region. And the war, you're absolutely correct, stating that it didn't begin in February of 2022. It started in February of 2014. The key issue over which the war started was Ukraine's desire to sign association agreement with European Union. Over that, the Orange Revolution took place. The new government committed itself doing that. So it wasn't membership in NATO, it wasn't membership in European Union. But the trick was that once Ukraine signs that agreement, and it eventually signed, it couldn't join any other similar bloc, trading bloc, or any other bloc. And that meant a major blow to Russian plans to recreate Moscow's control over the post-Soviet space in the form of so-called Eurasian Union. So signing that association agreement, Ukraine would be out, was out, and then the war is, again, started in 2014. This latest stage is continuation of the same war, but the trigger was an attempt of Ukraine to break out from the Russian sphere of influence.
So then when the Russians first went in 2014, then, there's virtually no response from the West, or none to really speak of. How does that make, I mean, you're Ukrainian. This must be a huge lesson for Ukrainians not to trust the West.
Certainly, there was a lot of disappointment, and after the takeover of the Crimea, some sanctions were introduced. But the real trigger became not so much the Crimea, but the shooting down of the Malaysian airplane with a lot of citizens of European Union. So to a degree, sanctions, really the turning point in the decision to introduce sanctions was about the tragedy that involved Europeans. Not first and second, the tragedy that affected the Ukrainians. Generally, there was certainly a policy that is difficult really to characterize in any other way but appeasement. After the Russian war against Georgia, Germany, they make decision to start Nord Stream 1. After the annexation of the Crimea, there would be Nord Stream 2. The Ukraine certainly got a lot of support, but certainly not enough support. Ukraine of 2022 had a much more capable army than in 2014, thanks to the American and Western support. Sanctions also helped to a degree, but all of that were, so to say, half measures. I am personally convinced that if the response to the aggression against Georgia would be at least half of what the response is today to the current stage of the war, if the response to 2014 would be at least half of what they were in 2022, we would not have that escalation, because the appeasement, and we know that from the history of the 1930s, just whets the appetite of the aggressor, and we fell into the same trap again.
Turning back to the Donbass and Crimea, some experts say that the Donbass and Crimea are, I guess they're speaking from a military standpoint, too difficult to reclaim. But I think the Ukrainian army is showing that's not necessarily the case. But if we look to how things can end, having read your book, I can't see how Ukraine would want to give up the Donbass or Crimea.
I really can't imagine any of the politicians who suggest that Ukraine give up territory really expecting from the governments in European Union, any government whatsoever, conducting war and saying that, okay, we don't mean it. We are fighting, but we are okay with part of our territory being taken over. Yes, we are fighting, but yeah, who cares about territorial integrity or sovereignty? That principle doesn't mean to us. And when it comes to the West, it looks like just an old imperial sort of thinking that, okay, the newer countries, they certainly don't live by our standards. It's okay for Zelensky to go out there and say that no, we are not going back to the borders of 1991. They would never imagine that about themselves. They would never imagine that about the older more established states. So there is a sort of colonialism and colonial discourse or expectations coming not only from Russia but also from the West. So well, in reality, wherever war ends in terms of the borders, for Ukrainians to say anything else, to fighting for anything else, would demonstrate their really immaturity as a nation, as a modern nation, and they're maturing very fast. So I would suggest to everyone who engages in that sort of rhetoric, just drop it. And with regard to the military aspect of the story, not political, not rhetorical, I'm not military expert. So it's difficult for me to say what is militarily easier to achieve, what is more difficult to achieve. What I can say that Ukrainians actually surprise us again and again in this war. There were already 3 very effective counteroffensive. Each of them were conducted under different circumstances. One, the battle for Kiev, that was won by Ukraine, pushed the Russians out of the wooded areas of northern Ukraine. The counteroffensive in Kharkiv in the east was conducted in a different way, in a different manner, and then in the south, Ukraine, the Russians were pushed from the right bank of Dnieper and had to leave Kherson, the only regional center that they ever captured, and that they actually hastened to include into the Russian territory and change the constitution. So we don't know how the counteroffensive in the south or in the east that everyone talks about today will end. But Ukrainians have already a track record of launching successful counteroffensive, using different tactics, doing that under different circumstances. So again, I'm not a military expert. I can't really answer that question, but I wouldn't be surprised if Ukrainians surprised us once again in that positive way.
I guess I now have a question which feels a bit strange to ask a historian, because I'm going to ask you a question about, I guess, the future. And I think you've hinted at this in our conversation, or you've mentioned this in the conversation, is that we should be very grateful to Ukraine for the fight that they're putting up, because there are other countries, there are other nations around the world that are threatened. I mean, I guess we've mentioned the Baltics and Moldova, but I mean, even Taiwan. This is an important fight that's going on now for places like Taiwan.
Indeed, because victory for Ukraine means really victory for the principle of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries in general, no matter where they are. And victory for Russia means victory for the great powers' really right to violate territorial integrity, to violate a principle of sovereignty anywhere in the world. And so far, what we saw in the world since really the great recession, and then through COVID, rise of the populism, rise of authoritarian tendencies, even in democratic countries, including United States. So you think about populism again. This is not just Europe. We can talk about UK as well, and really the principles of democracy and, broadly speaking, international law were in retreat. The authoritarian great powers were on the rise and served as a model for some of the allegedly democratic leaders in the West. So on the outcome of the war in Ukraine depends not just the future of the post-Soviet space, but as you're absolutely right to talk about China, to talk about Taiwan. Depends really the future of the democracy, and that sounds like an overstatement, but I'm just thinking about that again. Maybe it sounds like overstatement, but that's what I believe is really happening, because democracy has been in trouble. How many people were out there prepared to fight for it, to put their lives in risk, put their lives on line? That's what Ukrainians are doing. They're saying that they're fighting for freedom and democracy, and they mean it. They're not doing that to please the West and to get more armaments. Zelensky is doing that very well without using that sort of language. So that's what Ukrainians believe in, and the nation that resists Russian aggression is a sort of a nation that you can read about in textbooks. It's a political nation that is bilingual. The war on the Ukrainian side fought in 2 languages, as much in Russian as is in Ukrainian. It's nation that really builds unity, but by crossing ethnic lines and religious lines. The only nation in the world outside of Israel that is led by the president of Jewish background. Yes, I certainly believe Ukrainians when they're saying that they're fighting for freedom, for democracy, for the principles of democracy. So this is very important globally.
Yeah, I don't think it can be overstated how significant, because we're in a new world now, and as you say, a fight for democracy.
Yes.
Serhii, that's been wonderful to speak to you. Thank you very much, and I wish you every success with the book, which I think has come out. Is it today?
Well, it was released on May 16th.
16th. I didn't know.
Yeah, so it is three days old, or maybe 2.5 days old. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this book with you.
Well, I wish you every success with it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Oliver.
Thank you very much for listening. I do hope you enjoyed that. I certainly found it enlightening myself. Coming up, I've got Charles Spencer, the Parthenon Marbles, and the greatest British commander. But until then, thank you and good night.